Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on to chapter 25, Violence and Human Abuse. Objectives for this lecture is discuss the scope of the problem of violence in American communities, describe at least three factors in common in most communities that encourage violence and human abuse, identify common predictors in potential child abuse and indicators of its presence, define the four general types of child abuse: neglect, physical, emotional, and sexual. Describe the dynamics and signs of female abuse by male partners. Describe the growing community health problem of elderly abuse. Analyze the nursing role in working with survivors of violence, and discuss forensic nursing and its relationship to public health policy. What is violence? Well, violence comes from the Latin word volere, which means violate, injure, or rape. Violence is a public health problem that has both emotional and physical effects. Violence is a problem that deeply concerns nursing, especially by its significance of mortality and morbidity. So basically, nurses can often care for these victims and also the perpetrators and those who witness physical and psychological violence. Nurses can take an active role in developing community responses to this violence through working with public policy and needed resources in the community to combat violence. So social and community factors that influence violence. So many factors in the community can support or minimize violence. Changing social conditions, multiple demands on people, economic conditions, and social institutions influence the level of violence and human abuse. We're going to look at the following behaviors or conditions that describe factors and influence violent behavior. So let's look at and discuss work, education, media, organized religion, population, and community facilities. So how does work relate to violence? Um, Back in slavery days, it was believed that the husband of the family, especially taking on the abuse of the slave taskmasters, etc., would come home and then he would feel so undervalued and unfulfilled that he would come home and take out his frustrations on his wife and children. So again, work can be fulfilling and contribute to the sense of well-being, or it can be frustrating or unfulfilling. Okay, so workers can go home feeling physically and psychologically drained. And when they get home, they're tired, they're cranky, they're angry, they lash out. I gotta tell you, this is just personal. My husband, when after of having kids, you could stay home for the first 12 weeks, and after having three children on the fourth pregnancy, I had lots to say when my husband got home. He didn't want to hear it. He would say to me, "Please, let me get in the door, let me get a bath or shower, let me sit down and rest before you hit me with all the drama that went on in your day," because trust me, I had drama in mine. So when you consider those things, and I would respect his wishes, because most of the time I had put out the fire, so there was no need for me to keep in his ear, which would cause even more frustration. So I would give him a chance to decompress before I hit him with what went on in my world today, cutting out that frustrating and unfulfilling environment of being home. So this frustration and resentment can contribute to violent behavior. So workers may have difficulty separating feelings at work from those at home. I know a lot of times, especially with whatever went on in nursing, especially if a favorite patient died or whatever, I mentally was not prepared to deal with anything of a stressful level at home. People hesitate to give up jobs even when they're frustrating and boring and stressful, because think about it, you may have a hard time getting another. When we look at social and community factors in regards to education, we talk about schools have assumed many responsibilities traditionally that were assigned to the family, especially now. Schools will teach now sexual development, discipline children. They often serve as where the child can go to get fed, developmental and emotional support. Classes are really large, etc. All these things play into how education and is a community factor. So we talk about discipline, spanking, bullying, and come along in the educational setting, and schools can be a powerful contributor to nonviolence also. Now we don't, with our child abuse, we don't allow paddling, etc. in school. But a lot of education, we have a lot of entities in school, like your psychologists and child psychologists. We have a lot of therapists there to help us deal with the behaviors of stress that go on in school today. The media. Oh my God, TV programs. Some of them can be so violent. So they can inform and increase public awareness of violence, and definitely show you some really hardcore violence. Anytime you turn on the news, violence. A lot of our shows, violence. So then we look at the abused women and rape victims. Benefit from media attention. One of my favorite shows is Law and Order Special Victims Unit. I've learned a lot about abuse from that show, especially um, um, when we look at women and children, especially in that area. The media can indirectly also lead to violence, or it can be the biggest educator on resources for. So, ladies and gentlemen, many of us participate in organized religion. So, churches meet many human needs. These needs include a sense of value, belonging, closeness, worth. I remember when I first went to Texas, I didn't have any friends. The first thing I did was to seek out a church home, or not necessarily church home, but a place of worship where on Sundays, and eventually I developed friendships there in addition to my work friends. But churches, clergy, and other group members are definitely positive role models that should influence a peaceful behavior in society. Okay. Although churches they have been basically slow to recognize domestic violence, though they've been instrumental in changes that occur in domestic violence. So religion generally teaches nonviolent conflict resolution. However, historically, it seems contrary to relationships about abuse and religion. So think about it, because this was definitely a saying that my mom had: spare the rod, spoil the child. Okay, which means if I don't beat you down, you will not be worth a grain of salt in society. Okay, victimization of women, disapproved of. If you were being, I should say, victimized, you didn't get a divorce for that. That we would come to the minister. He's going to have a chat with everybody and straighten it out. That wasn't always the case, but if you had that deep religious concern, a lot of times you prayed about it. So when we look at population, the community structure and population can influence the potential for violence. Example, when people are poor, they live in crowded conditions. The potential for tension and violence is greater. So highly populated, dense communities can be positive or negative on influencing violence. Um, those with the sense of cohesiveness may have a lower crime rate, like your smaller communities. Okay, so you start to think of higher dense populations, more violence or violent, and then you think of your small rural areas as being less violence and more cohesive community. Everybody knows everybody. It's harder to get away with stuff when everybody knows everybody. Okay, then we have to look at your highly populated areas as in having gangs, given that feeling of inadequacy, despair, and alienation, especially if you can't keep up with the Joneses, you know, in the purchasing the homes, the clothes, the cars, etc. Now, social and community factors. We talk about communities differ in resources. Communities provide a large range of resources and facilities for residents. Some are more desirable places to live and work and raise your family, and some are not. Some are crime and violence ridden. You have some communities where there are a lot of recreational facilities, such as playgrounds, parks, swimming pools, movie theaters, tennis, basketball, sports courts. You get the feeling of community. You get the feeling of cohesiveness. Then there are places where you get the feeling of aggression and violence. Okay, so however you start to feel, one must seek some kind of guidance for their emotional distress. So some more places are more desirable than others. Some have more resources than others. Okay, and depending on where you live, may be a potentiation for violence or a decrease in violence. So we now want to look at violence against others or oneself. The potential for violence is against individuals like murder, robbery, rape, assault, or even on oneself as suicide is directly related to a level of violence in the community. Persons living in areas of high rates of crime and violence are more likely to be violent than those living in the peaceful, low dense populated areas. Major categories of violence are addressed here. So we want to talk about what they mean: homicide, killing a person, assault, physically attacking, verbally abusing, sexual violence, forcing a person to partake in a sexual act and you don't have consent. It's called rape. No means no. Suicide, the act or the instance of taking one's own life voluntarily or unintentional or intentional. Okay, suicide is definitely a rising public health issue. At Arrowhead, a lot of people come in and are feeling suicidal. I've even had people tell me they came in, now get this, because they're homicidal, and this is no joke. The gentleman told me that his drug dealer beat him up and took all his money and did not give him the drugs, and he came in because he was feeling like he was going to kill this man. He was feeling homicidal against his person who gives him drugs. I mean, I was astounded and shocked, but I had to take the man at his face value and what he said and treat him as such. So developmental patterns of abuse, factors contributing to family violence, how you were brought up. If you come from violence, you're more likely to be violent. Your living conditions. Remember, I said that an increased stress. If you're trying to keep up with the Joneses and you can't, they're always getting something. You're feeling totally inadequate. You're the only one working in your household, etc. You're going to start to get resentful. Most predictable presence is previous exposure. Okay, so learn that violence and these people learn that quickly is a way to manage conflict, and it is not. We have to reteach and relearn conflict analysis. So, types of violence. We're going to get more into this on our lecture on Wednesday, but we're going to talk about physical abuse. Now, physical abuse can be abuse against your spouse, can be, and that is men beating up their wife or the wife beating up her husband, okay? Or abuse against the children. It's physical means you hit. Sexual abuse means you abuse someone's body involuntarily. Neglect of children means you don't take care of them. They're home and nobody's home, okay? Your 5-year-old has to get up and get breakfast for himself. People don't see that as abuse, but it is, because he can get hurt in the process. Child abuse indicators we're going to talk about. Imminent partner abuse, signs of abuse, abuse as a process, abuse older adults, which is starting to really arise. And when we talk about especially partner abuse and in the hospital as a nurse, there are things I look for specifically. When my young lady comes in and she has abuse marks, etc., or keeps having accidents, quote unquote, and I start to watch how the husband acts. He doesn't let her be alone. He's always got an answer for everything. I immediately shut him down. I'm not talking to you. Or I will wait till he leaves to start asking questions. 9 times out of 10, though, he's not going to leave her alone. So I will get her to go down for a quote unquote fake test and tell him he can't come into the room, and then start asking a bunch of questions. I've gone to those extremes to find out if someone's being abused. Now, elderly abuse, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't have to be physical. It is a process where you can physically abuse. You can financially abuse the elderly. You can withdraw your care from them. Rough handling, where you're bruising. You neglect them by food, housing, and all those things are considered abuse of the elderly, and you can be prosecuted for that. So we're going to discuss those too, ladies and gentlemen. So nursing interventions begin with a community approach that incorporates strategies from criminal justice, education, social services, community advocacy, public health to prevent violence or our other healthcare crisis situations in the community. Okay, remember we're talking about violence and human abuse. So some communities look at different things. We look at school-based criteria to teach children and youth how to cope with anger and stress, frustration. Family programs to teach them how to deal with their children more effectively, how to deal with their frustrations from their job and environment. We have preschool programs that develop intellectual and social skills in children. We have public education programs that educate communities about the different forms of violence and ways to get help and intervene. Nursing home visitation programs for families at risk. We have lobbying and passage of legislation to outlaw physical punishment in children in schools, and marital rape, etc. Because years ago, you didn't rape your wife. There was no such thing. Women were a property of their husband. When he says jump, you ask how high. There was no such thing as, honey, I got a headache. Give it up. Okay? So what we teach now is We provide those interventions for each level of prevention for individuals, families, and community. So prevention strategies for violence, when we look at individual and family levels, number one thing is to assess. Okay, that's a secondary prevention. We assess marital discord, what you like and what you don't like, what ticks you off, what makes you livid with your spouse. That's a secondary. So remember, always, always, primary is education and teaching. Anytime you assess or assist, you look at secondary, okay? And then tertiary is treatment centers for abuse. Treatment centers and a lot of abuse, remember, gathers around substance abuse. So we want to teach stress reduction, educate about the developmental stages of children, especially so you're not so frustrated with the different things and behaviors of children, because children, even though there's no roadmap to raising them, they follow those developmental stages. There's a stage when they're whiny. There's a stage when they are smart alecky, etc. So those are all things you need to know. Identify anybody who needs to be or at risk and needs counseling, okay, and then get them into that tertiary environment. Community levels, the way we need to develop policies, conduct community resources mapping, collaborate with the community to develop systematic responses to violence, develop media campaigns. We can use media for something more than portraying violence. Develop resources such as shelters and homes for transitioning from a violent situation, okay? Or a safe haven where you can go when you're being abused, where you can get away from that individual, where you can get help. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to move on with our lectures.